As Josh said, yeah, my name's Shaun Grassel. I'm the CEO of Buffalo Nations Grasslands Alliance. And, we're getting right on time. And, I'm here to talk about some non-economic values of grasslands. Let's see. First of all, I wanted to just explain who we are and what we do and kind of give you some context of some of the things I'm going to talk about. But Buffalo Nations Grasslands Alliance, like I said, we're a native-led nonprofit. Our purpose is to ensure the 16 native nations in the Northern Great Plains have the technical and financial resources to plan and act on their vision for their traditional lands and waters. This organization has only been around since 2021, so we're relatively young. But it started as a group of other wildlife biologists and program directors for tribes in the Northern Great Plains about 10 years ago, where we started to kind of ask ourselves questions about what we could do to raise more revenue for our programs and so we could do more conservation work on the ground. And over the course of several years and from support from World Wildlife Fund and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, we kind of evolved into a 501c3. I've been in this position for almost 3 years, but really we were established to really support the tribes in the Northern Great Plains with all of the grassland kind of related work, and also tribal wildlife conservation work, and also to build capacity within tribal programs. In the Northern Great Plains, there are 16 native nations that have about 10 million acres of trust land, and about 80% of those lands are intact. So tribes have a great deal of grassland. So when Laura reached out to us and asked, if we could be here today and talk about the non-economic values of grasslands, I said, sure, whatever we can do. Not really knowing, exactly what I would say or what I would talk about. It seems like, in a capitalist society, we can put a dollar amount on anything. We heard some numbers this morning about, hunting and, raising livestock and things like that. But how do you put value on things like experiences or tradition, things like that? Like I mentioned, economists, insurance companies, they can find ways to put a dollar amount or a value on a lot of things that we do, but I wanted to visit a little bit about some of the things that, at least for me, that are really hard to put an economic value on. And I think most people in this room would probably agree with a lot of it. And so the first part, I just wanted to talk a little bit about just unique experiences. Kevin talked about, the importance of hunting in South Dakota, and, I totally agree with that. But there are also some of those things of just being able to, get outside, enjoy the outdoors, and just witness things that are just unique or rare. Like an opportunity to see sharp-tailed grouse doing their courtship displays. How do you put an economic value on that experience of being able to see that? Or some of the, social behaviors of female bison when they have calves at their side, and observing kind of what they do and how they interact. What kind of, value does that have? Or just seeing a badger just doing his thing. Badgers are primarily nocturnal. You see a lot of roadkill, but being able to see one, tearing up the dirt, throwing dirt, that's a really cool experience. Or one of the most endangered mammals in North America. This last year, there were less than 300 black-footed ferrets in the wild. And if you're lucky enough to see one, you're one of the few people that have. And how do you put a value on that? And I wanted to say this, without grasslands, the picture they had up before, like none of those things would be possible. Those are all grassland-dependent species. We heard this morning too about things like, getting your kids exposed to learning experiences and the tradition of hunting. But grasslands also support, foods and medicine for people. And it's an opportunity when you practice that exercise, to transfer that knowledge down to the next generation. And, without grasslands, some of these practices like harvesting chokecherries or sage or prairie turnips, those things wouldn't be possible. And we'd be talking about those experiences, in the past tense, if grasslands weren't around. I keep looking at this computer thinking that it's my slide, but it's somebody else's. Anyway, we talked a lot about hunting, but then also just that hunting heritage. My son would not be happy if he knew that. But putting that price tag on, not only harvesting, plants and berries from the prairies, but harvesting the animals that are on the prairies, and then instilling that hunting tradition, into the next generation. My son is a member of the NESBR, and with that he has treaty rights to hunt a large part of Idaho, Southeast Oregon. And I had the opportunity to go with him when he exercised his treaty rights and got his first elk. And you think about like what kind of value he put on that. And he comes out and he hunts deer here. When he was just a young guy when he got his first buffalo at Lower Brule. But those memories and those traditions that are passed on, those things are priceless. And then grasslands they're an outdoor classroom. Books and photos and everything are great, but if you can get outside and teach kids, what are in those books and what are in those pictures, it's a great experience. Every one of us have learned something, from nature. And if you went to grad school and had a research project outside, you learned a lot from nature. And and what not a better place than to just take your kids or take younger people or anybody and just to go wander around and see what you can see and see what's happening out there in the grasslands. And it might just be like the traditional things like bugs or plants, but outdoor experiences include things like harvesting a buffalo, teaching kids the traditional uses of buffalo, all the parts that were used, how they were collected. You couldn't do that without grasslands. And then also, not only come from a science perspective, but history. The picture on the left is a nephew of mine who works for the tribe up at Lower Brule, and he's with a group of students, and he took them out to different places on our reservation and just talked about the historical significance of some of those sites, why they were important, why they're being taught, what's important about those lands. And so history and culture, can be taught just from, getting out on our grasslands. Now I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about cultural site protection. This is something that I don't think really ever enters the grassland conservation space. And I thought these slides would be better, or you'd be able to see more. I apologize. But this area here, that's in Arikara village. And those are earth lodge floors. And this is an intact site. And so this is what grasslands help protect, is keeping this site intact. It's hard to see, but you see crisp edges around those sites. There's several of them, many of them. And the extent of this is several hundred yards long and a couple hundred yards wide. But that's a well-protected, intact site. But this is what most of them look like. There's a few that are outside the footprint of this ag field. And so they have nice crisp edges. If you're out there in the land, you'll see them. The ground is raised up. But this was a field, and I couldn't tell you how long ago it was farmed, but it hasn't been farmed for several decades. So this is kind of go-back land, as it's called. It's almost indistinguishable from the native prairie around it, except when you drive across it, you can feel the furrow. But most of those sites are gone. Most of the earth lodge floors are gone. You can see remnants, You can see some little, like some mounds, you can see some, some texture out there. But for the most part, this wasn't probably farmed for very long, and that site is almost gone. And here's kind of the most striking example that I came across. But this is, and I'm sorry for the folks on that end, I'm pointing on this screen. But that prominent line is an old road, and it was farmed on both sides. But this side, over here on the left, wasn't farmed. But this whole area is an archaeological site. And you can see a little, a few things here and there. And I don't know the story behind this, if this was purposefully restored or if it was just kind of naturally restored, but it's pretty striking. And this is just another example of, right, this line here is a fence line, and this is just the remnant of an archaeological site of a Urkara village. And this whole area out through here was part of that site, but it's gone. And so, we talk a lot about, conversion of rangeland, to cropland, and then, the opportunities that might exist to restore those lands and how to go about restoring those lands. But things like this can't be restored. I mean, they're erased, from the landscape. They're pretty much gone forever. That's what I had. Kind of ended on a somber note there, but I think that the last point I think was important, that cultural site protection just isn't in the conversation when it comes to conserving grasslands. So it should be.